Now, if there's one thing a conservative loves, it's hierarchy, and Reform UK are no different. One particular bugbear for the hard right in the UK, from the constitutional reforms of the New Labour era, is the Equality Act, a groundbreaking piece of legislation that has created the framework to at least try and make our society more meritocratic. On Tuesday, Reform's Equality spokesperson Suella Braverman confirmed that they would repeal that act, and they sent Robert Generick onto the BBC this morning to defend that policy.
We, of course, want to see the protections that have been put in place over the years maintained, like the Equal Pay Act, that ensured that women received the same pay as men in the workplace, or the Race Equality Act, or the Disability Discrimination Act, pieces of legislation that made our country a fairer place. What we disagree with, as millions of people do across the country, was the very harmful piece of legislation that was put in place, again by a dying government, by Gordon Brown and Harriet Harman at the end of that parliament just before the 2010 general election, which has created perverse situations in this country where, say, a white working class boy from the town that I represent, Newark in North Nottinghamshire, couldn't apply for an internship at GCHQ or the Foreign Office or the Bank of England because they had decided to do an internship scheme that was only applicable to people with a certain skin colour and could hide behind this piece of law to defend their actions. We believe in equality before the law, where everyone in this country is born equal, and that we build a society where everyone can get the same opportunities. They need legal protections at times to ensure that happens, but we don't want to create perverse situations where different groups, faiths and skin colours get different treatment to others. That's wrong, that isn't British, and Reform is going to change that.
Charlie State then quizzed Generick on his own experiences, and it led to an absurd assertion by Robert Generick.
Do you think you, as an individual, have ever been subject to discrimination?
Not especially. I mean, look, I've seen discrimination in my life. I grew up in Wolverhampton in the 1980s and 90s, where I witnessed racism amongst friends and neighbours that I had. I have Jewish children today with my wife and have been subject, or seen them and my wife subject to anti-Semitism. So I do have some understanding of what some sections of our society face, and that is one of the things that drives me in politics.
And I want
a fairer society where people can all have access to opportunities irrespective of their gender, their faith, or their skin colour.
The reason I asked that question...
If I may just finish the point, the problem with the legislation as it is today, why Reform wants to change it, is it is creating mad, perverse situations where some groups, for example, white working class boys, who we know the evidence suggests are actually performing amongst the worst in our education system today, are actually positively discriminated against, and that is protected under this law. So we want to rebalance the playing field, and the principle that we're going to ensure is, as I say, equality before the law.
The reason I asked you that question about, whether you yourself have been subject to discrimination is those people who have benefited over the years from the 2010 Equality Act, which you wish to get rid of, might well say, well, if it hadn't been there, unfair things would have happened to me. That necessarily is true because they use those laws to protect themselves.
I don't think that's right. Look,
so there would be no one who's benefited from those laws?
I don't think on balance that's correct, no.
So he's just talking bollocks here, by the way. The Equality Act added necessary protections that were not included in the previous legislation that Generick is referencing. And you'll not be in any way surprised to find out that a lot of it is around employment law. I can't believe a party funded by multimillionaires would look into that. This includes outlawing pay secrecy clauses so that workers can freely discuss pay to ensure full transparency from their employer, and outlawing pre-employment health checks to prevent employers from filtering out the disabled. And he's also wrong about the positive action provisions. No one is forced to use them, and the Act specifically carves out that they cannot be used to automatically favour any group or to promote a candidate of a specific demographic over a more qualified candidate. That is positive discrimination, which is illegal, by the way. The anti-DEI push by the right is yet more yank slop imported by MPs who either spend too much time on Twitter or too much time reading Heritage Foundation press releases and think that kind of positive discrimination that happens in the United States is what is happening over here, where again, it is already outlawed. Now, whilst Robert Generick is a seasoned media performer, the same can't really be said of Zia Yusuf, Reform's Home Affairs spokesperson, who did not get as easy a time as Generick when he was pressed on this issue by Victoria Derbyshire.
Which do you not want to protect? Is it sex?
Well, hold on.
No, I'm going to go through the list. Will you protect sex?
But you've got to look at how all of these things work together. With respect, you can't reduce a serious conversation like this to 2 minutes.
Forgive me. I am not reducing anything. I am literally going to go through the protected characteristics and ask what a reform government. Whether the reform government would protect them in the future or not. The fundamental problem with the line of questioning here is that you're not going to ask me about the fundamental point that I'm making, which is that, for example, social class is not listed or mentioned in that at all. I'll ask you in a moment. Are you going to protect sex?
We believe that regardless of your biological sex, you should have an equal right to a job.
OK. Are you going to protect...
Now, whether that...
OK. I'm sorry, we've got a list here.
OK, fine, go ahead.
Are you going to protect sexual orientation?
Yes, those things... Well,
disability?
Again, but we've got to be clear about what we mean when we say protect, right? Because the way the Act is drafted, again, there are a lot of things that are positive duties that are placed on people like employers, for example. There are laws in other statutes, by the way, that protect people from discrimination. But we've also got to be clear that the way the Act ends up functioning is as a result of all of these things being put together. So if you're going to try and create an exhaustive list...
It consolidated a lot of legislation.
Yeah.
Disability.
We've already covered that, yes.
Race.
Yes, we would
religion.
Protect that. Hold on. So I want to make the point again. If we go through every type of...
there aren't many left.
If we go through every type of discrimination you would want to get to, again, we end up with, you've got to read the Act in full because of... So, for example, if the Act actually legislated against discriminating based on biological sex, for example, then a lot of the outcomes, the negative outcomes for white working class boys in particular, would not be happening. Okay. Where the devil is in the detail, where it starts talking about positive action. And, you know, we've seen examples of this. It was our own His Majesty's Royal Air Force some years ago, ended up losing a tribunal because that was a real obvious, frankly, open and shut case where they were routinely discriminating against men, for example, for those positions.
Hang on a minute. So if the statutes that already exist found that the RAF were discriminating against men, then you're admitting the legal framework as it currently is works to protect them as intended. It protects men and boys from discrimination. And second of all, class was addressed in the Equality Act until it was removed by the Conservative Party, of which 80% of Reform's cosplay shadow cabinet used to be members of. This socio-economic duty clause removed by Theresa May would have required public bodies to ensure they were addressing class inequality and to try and improve outcomes in the deprived areas that Zia Yusuf seemingly cares so much about. It's those same areas where we see huge amounts of social deprivation affecting working class people now after 14 years of Tory austerity. The kind of austerity that both Reform and the Tories say we should do even more of. Now, class is not treated as a protected characteristic, as it's much harder to define and it's not innate, as the others are. But the protections removed by Theresa May should absolutely be put back. Luckily for Newsnight viewers, former Green Party MP Caroline Lucas was on hand to give Yusuf a richly deserved dressing down.
I want to say that your position is utterly incoherent. You have cited no evidence that suggests that it's the Equalities Act that is responsible for discrimination against white working class boys. And when it comes to the wider issue of taking your word on anything that you've said, it seems to be a really muddled message that when you say something about Robert Generick a few years ago and you don't really know him, we're not to take it seriously, whereas now we are to take you seriously. I mean, why would you put something out in the public domain in a very public way that was not in any way, ambiguous? It was a very strong message against Robert Generick, and now suddenly we're to believe it. We've got Suella Braverman ripping up the Equalities Act. We've got Richard Tice suggesting now that people are going to end up with far more expensive energy bills, quite frankly, because he wants to go drilling more in the North Sea rather than using renewable energy. We've got a party that pretends to be an insurgent party, an anti-establishment, anti-elite party, and yet it's stuffed full of old Tory retreads. I mean, it just doesn't add up. And I think people looking at this press conference this afternoon are just going to feel this party just doesn't know what it's doing. The interesting thing, of course, was that Nigel Farage was trying to present the other spokespeople as a way of saying, it's no longer just about me, it's about all of us. 25 questions he was asked by the press, Rather, all of you were asked by the press, and Nigel Farage answered all of them.
Well, given Yusuf's performance there, I'm not surprised that up to this point, Farage has kept it the one-man band that it has been so far. Dahlia. Now, of course, these media performances are quite funny to watch, but the point they're making is very serious, and the things that they will do and the externalities of those policies are very dangerous. What's your take on them deciding that they want to get rid of the Equality Act?
I mean, it is nothing to do with, I think that the using of white working class boys as somehow the victims of, or having been victimized by the Equalities Act, is a really manipulative sleight of hand. Because what you actually have here is conditions for white working class boys, as is the case for all of the working class, have been deteriorating. They've been deteriorating significantly since austerity, but they've been deteriorating, I would argue, for a while now, since the 70s. The reasons for that is because we have removed regulation that protects workers' rights in this country. We have weakened the labour movement. We have slashed the welfare state, meaning that if you are unable, if your employer doesn't pay you enough to live a decent life, you can't find support from the state to help plug that gap. Housing is out of control. The cost of living is out of control. These are structural class war issues that white working class boys, like all other members of the working class, have been negatively affected by. But when they associate that decline with the introduction of the 2010 Equalities Act, what they are trying to say there is that the reason that the conditions of working class boys have declined in recent years is because Black and brown people have taken their place, which they do not deserve. I have personal experience of this. In every educational institution I have been in, I now work at a university. I've been through the education system. I've been in various kinds of employment. And any time I've been in a form of employment or education that has been considered high achieving or exclusive in some way, without fail, every single time, someone has made an implication, directly or indirectly, that the only reason I got in is because of my race or gender. And the thing that I always like to say back to them is like, well, if the reason I got in here is because of my race and gender, then why am I the only woman of color in this room? Clearly, I'm not unfairly taking the place of someone else. It's that actually this entire space is socially and culturally and on a class level skewed towards a certain demographic. And I have got here, in whether it is through an inclusion program or not, even though I haven't actually gotten through on any explicit inclusion programs. But even if that is the case, it's because this entire context is skewed against me to begin with. But it is a classic sleight of hand by conflating the decline in conditions for white working class people, which is a structural problem, which is a consequence of the very kinds of politics that Nigel Farage and his neoliberal cadre have supported in this country for decades now, including the now washed up Tories that now populate Reform's shadow cabinet. The attributing of that decline to the unfair entrance of Black and brown people into various parts of the labour market. Generick used that example of saying white working class boys in this country can't get onto internships because these internships are exclusively for Black and brown people, for people of colour or racially minoritized people. No, I mean, there has been a complete collapse in youth employment. There has been a complete collapse in the availability of internships that are actually accessible for working class people. There has been a complete collapse in wages. There's been a complete collapse in graduate jobs. That's not because a couple of industries have had internships for underrepresented minorities. But it's a way of converting this class-based structural problem, which reformist politics are invested in furthering, and in fact just trying to turn different parts of the working class against one another. But that is exactly the kind of effect that he is trying to achieve.
And it's really worth just reiterating this. Positive discrimination is not legal in this country. You cannot deliberately hire people who are of lower merit just because of their demographic characteristics over somebody with higher merit. You cannot do that. That is illegal. And it's the Equality Act that has allowed there to be a provision to be able to choose somebody from an underrepresented minority if they are underrepresented as to achieve the aim of getting them more equal representation in that area. You cannot use it for positive discrimination. All the claims that is happening are just totally untrue. And you'd only think that if their entire politics was seen through the prism of the American DEI system, which is in no way similar to the EDI one that we have in this country. And if you really want to look at the problems facing working class communities in this country, austerity is obviously patient zero. And not only did Robert Generick praise George Osborne and David Cameron in his video that he did when he was trying to become the Conservative Party leader, he did a speech as Reform's shadow chancellor. He's just a spokesperson on economic issues in reality, where he was echoing all the same kind of sentiments about the economy that George Osborne was saying in the 2010s when they were slashing access to programs for people from underrepresented backgrounds, right? For example, you look at the music industry nowadays, where the bands that you see are all from pretty privileged upbringings because people who come from poorer backgrounds, they can't afford instruments, they can't afford rehearsal space, they don't get adequate provision for learning music at school because these are poorer areas with lower budgets. And that's a deliberate result of the cuts to those schemes from the Osborne administration. Cuts that the Reform UK cabinet have no intention of reversing. Now, it's not just your equality protections at work that Reform are coming for. They're also coming for your wages. Their business and trade spokesperson Richard Tice has said that the party would consider looking at a reduction in the UK's minimum wage for young people, responding to questions around high levels of youth unemployment. And Reform's rhetoric is already filtering through to the public, and discussions around workplace protection made it onto Nick Ferrari's morning show. Here's what one caller thought about it all.
Remove all minimum wage legislation. It's absolute nonsense that the government is involved in this. The wage set should be purely what a business can afford or want to pay in an irrational marketplace. That is how it would be. And if the government really wanted to help workers of all ages, especially young workers, they'd stop all immigration.
Nick,
simple.
Nick, some would say, what the dickens are you talking about? Because we'll just have Scrooge bosses paying people pennies.
No, we wouldn't, because they wouldn't be able to get workers to come and work. It's a free marketplace, and if they don't like the wages and they don't like the work, don't take the job. There is absolutely no reason why employment shouldn't be arbitrated between an employee, and employer.
All right, so a boss decides to sack a woman because she's got pregnant. What are you going to do then?
Oh, I would allow it to happen.
What? Have you not had enough sleep?
Tasty boots there from that caller into Nick Ferrari's show. But I think the thing that, outside of the firing somebody for getting pregnant, which crazy to me, but then again, that's just how libertarians think. The idea that there's no reason why the government should be getting involved, or why it shouldn't just be a negotiation on a one-to-one basis between the employer and the employee, maybe because it leads to negative externalities, like people having to work far more hours than they usually would be able to do so to have a fulfilling life, to be able to make ends meet. That's the whole point of a living wage, insofar as I'm concerned. If you want to start a business and you cannot afford to pay somebody enough for them to live, to do the work at a normal weekly hours, then you don't deserve to be in business, in my opinion. I'm sorry, that's just the case of it. If people do jobs to be able to afford to live, if they can't afford to live off of that job doesn't pay enough. Dahlia, what's your reaction?
Well, the thing is reformism, Trumpism, this particular iteration of right-wing politics that we are seeing, they make a lot of noise about the EU and culture and trans people and immigration and all of this, but at their core, they are simply a vehicle for tearing up any part of the state that protects workers from bosses, that protects ordinary people. And I deliberately don't use the term anti-state because they're not anti-state. They're anti the welfare state. They're anti the social state. They are very pro the war state, the police state, the business state. So they're very in favor of the state for example, intervening so that a business can exploit its workers, or they are very pro-estate that creates the conditions for businesses or corporations to exploit our labor, land, resources, etc. But ever since the post-war consensus, and ever since this idea of a social state or a welfare state, or a state that can curb the excesses, the most extreme excesses of capitalism and protect ordinary people, ever since that idea was born, with all of its flaws and all of its limitations and all of the ways in which it's been contradictory and limited and whatever, but ever since it was born, there has been a very organized faction of the elite who have done everything in their power to try and destroy it. They were against the NHS when the NHS was first emerged, and they have continued to be against everything that the welfare or social state represents. And the decimation of that begins with Thatcherism, but it continues on, and it is now in this accelerated form of Trumpism and reformism. It's sort of neoliberalism unchained, if you will. Enoch Powell, for example, we remember him a lot for his racist Rivers of Blood speech. But the other side of that coin was the fact that he was one of the most important early vocal supporters of the Institute of Economic Affairs, which is the most rampant anti-social state, neoliberal think tank in this country, the one that was behind Liz Truss's disastrous budget. So this kind of anti-woke or anti-EDI or anti-DEI politics, the politics that Doge went in and slashed up the social security in the name of, it is a Trojan horse. It is whipping up this idea that Black and brown people, that women, that trans people, that migrants, any kind of socially or culturally minoritized person has taken more than they deserve from the state. So we're going to go in, we're going to cut this government waste. We're not going to give them anything that they don't deserve to have, or we're going to sort of under this umbrella of somehow that racialized people have been given a too good of a deal by the state. And they use that as cover to go in and tear up the protections and the infrastructure of the social state that actually protects all workers. It's it's the only concession that we have won in capitalism is things like the minimum wage and things like the weekend and parental leave, pensions. These are the very few concessions that the labor movement have managed to get under capitalism, and these people are hell-bent on tearing that up. And they use anti-DEI, anti-woke, anti-affirmative action rhetoric in order to gain consent from people to do that.